Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So, hello and welcome to a very special episode we're recording today with Professor Christine Fair, professor in the Security Studies program with the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She's out with a new book titled The Literature of Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, co-authored with Safina Ustad. So, thank you so much, Professor, for taking your time and speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
At the onset, I want to ask you a little bit to elaborate on how this volume aims to fill the gap in the existing scholarship by focusing on the Lashkar-e-Tayyaba and its Urdu language publication. Probably if you could share a little bit on the ideology, the fundraising, and the volunteer cultivation that you've covered in the book.
So to say that it fills a gap presupposes that someone wants to read through the 650 odd page book. So I'm not going to, have some kind of hubris to think that there's a large market for this book. But in some ways, it's the prequel to my last book on Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. And I talk about the intention of bringing this book out when I wrote that book. And so I think the thinking that went behind it was that, we're kind of lucky in a way that Lashkar-e-Tayyaba has such a huge of its musings about who it is as an organization, what it does, why it does it, who it kills, just as importantly, who it doesn't kill, what's its relationship to the state. And the thing that always amazed me was, while Pakistan, for example, would say, nothing to do with the Pakistan army, in these books that we translate, just the opposite is true. Right? There's all sorts of evidence that ties this organization to the ISI and to the military, as well as to members of the political establishment. And whereas Pakistan always says, no, Lashkar-e-Tayyaba didn't do this attack or that attack. One of the books that we translate an excerpt from, and it appears quite late in the volume, is on the Lashkar-e-Tayyaba 2000 attack on the Red Fort. And that document tells us a lot about what it was doing at the Red Fort. It even has photos. Now, the photos in the original are quite grainy, so the photos of the photos are even grainier. But I think it might be interesting for particularly Indians who are much more directly affected by this organization to see what they say about the attacks that Pakistan itself has denied. But I also think that for people who are genuine scholars of terrorism, as opposed to like the casual observer, for whom this book may not be appropriate, frankly speaking, they should read the other book. But for people who really want to get their head around this organization, I think it'll be an important resource. And at least that was the hope.
And this brings me to understanding this volume that you've created. Like I have read the first 4 chapters and I can tell the amount of literature that has gone into it. Could you take us through how you navigated the selection of materials for this volume?
Let me just say, I had at one point in my life aspired to do the same thing for Jaish-e-Mohammed. And this project has convinced me that is a bad idea. I'll never do this kind of project again, because it's literally taken my entire adult life. So in some sense, data collection for this began in 1995. 1995. When were you born?
I was born in 98, so 3 years before you started. I was born.
So maybe your parents even hadn't been married yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, I mean, this book has been like a child that's grown up and gone to college and is already seeking psychotherapy from my wackadoonery in parenting. So it began. So I don't think a lot of people know that I did my dissertation on the Punjabi historical novel as it was appropriated by Sikhs in diaspora. So when I went to Pakistan in 1995. I was doing my PhD in South Asian languages and civilizations. I am not a political scientist. Many people confuse me for one because of the kind of work that I do. But I went there as a language student, and I wanted to learn Urdu literature, but I really wanted to learn Punjabi because that was where my heart was. But you don't live in Lahore. And I was a very, curious person. So I went around and just with my eyes open, and you could not escape the fundraising efforts of Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. People would come on buses and they would ask to make donations. At different stores on Mall Road, there would be a box where they would ask you to make donations. During Eid, there would be a large mela on Mall Road, and the organizations would be fundraising. They would ask people to donate the pelts from the animal sacrifices of Bakr Eid. And there were bookstores, that sold their stuff. And Lashkar-e-Tayyiba it's kind of diluted that somewhat. In those days, it had a very distinctive way of depicting things. Like, anime has certain features, then you're like, oh yeah, that's anime. Anyone who knew what their trademark representations look like could spot a Lashkar item from a very long distance. So just having my eyes open, and the covers were always kind of exciting. I started accumulating this stuff over many, many trips to Pakistan. And I finally was kicked out of Pakistan in 2013. The Pakistan army got really upset with me. And so I was a little bit worried about this, but it turns out that the PL 480 program, which used to be this program back when India and Pakistan and other countries were in the 50s, where they're having massive food insecurity, we provided wheat. And the countries that received the wheat paid for it in non-convertible rupees. So the PL 480 program itself is defunct, but those non-convertible funds are used to purchase books in the countries that benefited from the PL 480 program. So basically, there's some person in Pakistan who is buying Lashkar-e-Tayyaba publications, and then they get shipped to the Library of Congress, and also other colleges and universities that receive PL 480 books. And so the University of Chicago has a big collection, University of Pennsylvania, University of Harvard, and so on. So that's how we subsequently got the books. Once we sort of, as a data person, because I moved a long way from my PhD, I'm a data person. So from a data point of view, this project was maddening, right? Because you never got what we would call the universe of publications, right? Lashkar-e-Tayyiba doesn't put out a catalog of all of his works. So, you never know how representative this is of their oeuvre. So once we got the materials, then we had to weed through them. And I just scanned every single book. Safina and I, and that's a takalus because my co-author is Pakistani, and Safina wants to protect Pakistani family members, and also Safina's ability to return to Pakistan when desired. So those some that were really obvious. So Hum Jihad Kyun Kar Rahe Hain, that was really obvious. So that's sort of like its foundational document that tells, well, it answers an important question: why are we waging jihad? Another important document that was pretty obvious was Jihad, right? Defending Jihad. But then the other ones, we had some questions. We wanted to know, like, how does this organization operate? Who it is, who it kills, who it doesn't kill. How does it represent the acts of violence that it commits to others? And so some documents were recruitment documents. So we have a document that basically teaches activists to recruit from colleges. We had a document that I thought showed a really important schism between, this is the refutation of takfir, the problem with takfir, because Lashkar does not do takfir. That document's important because it explains why Lashkar doesn't do takfir and is frequently in very stark conflict with Islamic State and the Deobandi groups that do practice takfir. So, from my point of view, this wasn't the most scientific process because it couldn't be. But what we tried to do was present a selection that would help people. And newsflash, if anyone wants to help me build the website where I can put all of the originals up, I'd be grateful for the help. I think it's important that people have access to the original Urdu materials as opposed to just be reliant upon our translation, but I don't have the bandwidth to do it. I've had a lot of health issues and I'm exhausted.
I mean, that would be a great help for other researchers as well to actually want to access it. I mean,
I have another fascinating document, which is not included in this book, but we're trying to get a publisher to publish it separately, which lays out Lashkar-e-Tayyaba's relationship with the Pakistan Army and other security forces. So West Point, I mean, it takes some money, right, to do this, and it takes someone who's going to index it and all this garbage. So I have a website. I would also, be happy to donate it, to send the files to someone who would host it with attribution. So I'm open, but I think I'm trying to find ways of making the primary source material available. And I have a lot of it. There's so much of it.
So this actually, I wanted to ask you from this point, because it's interesting, because you brought how casually jihadi material were transferred from Pakistan to America. And in the late 80s, we have seen how the formation of LET took place, and its subsequent designation as a terrorist organization only took place in 2001. So how did the American attention actually went to this organization, and what geopolitical factors might have actually brought the attention to LET, provided that a lot of policymakers have mentioned that LET's focus is very narrow and it's only towards the Indian subcontinent?
So let me just first say about the PL 480. There's a lot of goofiness about writing a book like this. And I proposed to write an op-ed about it. I'm just waiting to see if the editor accepts the proposal. All right. So I think I was floored to learn that we're buying terrorist literature, utterly floored. And I don't know Arabic, but I'm curious to know if we're also buying Arabic language terrorist literature, because it's against the law to materially contribute to a foreign terrorist organization. Lashkar-e-Tayyiba is an FTO, so that's kind of a curious thing. I remember when I was talking about this project years ago, it must have been 10 years ago. Yeah, it was after I was kicked out of Pakistan. I was talking to a woman who worked for one of our intelligence agencies, and she said, "I'm just really confused, Christine. How are you still getting these materials?" And I blushed. I felt really sheepish because I didn't know how to tell her without embarrassing her. I said, "Well, ma'am, we're going to the Library of Congress and to the University of Chicago and to Harvard and to the University of Pennsylvania." And she looked stunned. So clearly no one knew about this, right? Which and I'm still just kind of baffled by it by myself. But, then I was talking to a very senior intelligence official, and I was like, so does this bother you? he said, and he says, well, there's no better way of protecting terrorist literature than keeping it in a library, which is true. How many Gen Zers or whatever gen we're on is going to go to a library to become a terrorist? So I actually had a good laugh at it. But there were also other absurdities, like there were concerns that this violate Lashkar-e-Tayyaba's copyright. Okay, so I literally had to have conversations with the U.S. Copyright Office about this. And it ended up, he also had a pretty funny quip about it. He says, yeah, so if they file a copyright concern, it's going to go to the Southern District of New York, 9/11. And I don't think they're going to entertain the Lashkar fellow showing up to lodge a copyright complaint.
Like out of everything, Lashkar filing a complaint for copyright.
Right. There were just these bizarre things that had to be resolved before we got the contract. And of course, India, because the publisher is also based in India, they were concerned that Lashkar-e-Tayyaba would sue. And we had to secure legal counsel to advise on this. And I found it at some point they asked me, well, can't you send a letter to Lashkar-e-Tayyiba and ask for permission? So I said to the acquisitions editor at the time, I said, let me get this straight. Do you want me to go to Georgetown's legal office to ask them for permission, for me to ask a foreign terrorist organization for permission to copyright, to give me translation rights pro bono? You don't think that there's an optics problem there? So, so I really do want to write, a piece just sort of explaining the insanity that one has to sort of endure to get final publication clearance for a book like this. And it totally disabused me of ever wanting to do a similar project for, say, Jaish Muhammad. No way, not happening. Someone else can do it.
I can completely understand the amount of research and depth it has went through. I actually want to ask you, like, a period actually which probably you were there in Pakistan and you just left Pakistan in between that period, or Pervez Musharraf. He actually was a very interesting figure because he was one to actually not ban but actually designate them as a organization, terrorist organization, and kind of shadow banned it, and its subsequent re-emergence under different names, of course. Could you discuss how
yeah, first of all, there was no real ban.
Yeah.
Basically, I told oh, for us, we're going to have things because Merca is mad. They were all warned in advance. They moved all their money. They basically just changed their names. So there was no real ban. And also, the U.S. pretended to care after 9/11, but it really didn't care. I had a lot of conversations with people because at this time I was still at the RAND Corporation, and then subsequently I was at USIP, and then I was back at RAND. So no one cared. And I'm going to tell you what really struck me is that even U.S. Central Command did not really care. When I worked with the United Nations, I was doing the suicide bombing report for UNAMA, as a consequence of which I visited various places. And I visited some J2 guys. These are the intel guys, joint intelligence. I guess they were out in Jalalabad. And this guy just casually tosses in, yeah, we're seeing a bunch of let activity. And I said, let activity? What on earth are you talking about? Because they pronounce acronyms, right? I said, oh, you mean LET? And this was in 2007, right? Where a lot of people we're still not caring about Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. And I said, so are you reporting this to CENTCOM? And he says, well, not really, because this is not a reporting target. And I was like, you have to have a conversation with who your reporting chain of command, because this is really, really important that you are seeing the let, if you will, in your AOR. So I was astonished. I went back to Kabul and I told my boss, his name was Chris Alexander at the time. He was the deputy SRSG. And we were both just utterly floored that people, so that's how little this organization was on the radar screen of the United States in real terms. That began to change in 2008 after the Mumbai attack, of course, when Americans and Israelis were killed, right? That changed. But if you look at the US behavior, so it put more teeth on it, and it drafted various sorts of, if you don't see material support, blah, 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 then we're not going to continue security assistance. But you'll also notice that Secretary Clinton herself argued for a national security waiver of those prohibitions. So from my point of view, I really haven't seen a lot of follow through on Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. And even though Lashkar-e-Tayyaba did kill American troops in Afghanistan. So I've always been kind of baffled by the difference in what the US has said and what the US has actually done when it comes to this group, but also Jaish-e-Mohammed, right, which has always had close ties with the Taliban and other organizations that have attacked the US in Pakistan.
And this is actually something interesting, because you mentioned in your book about the twin concept that Lashkar-e-Tayyiba follows Jihad and Dawah. So could you establish a little bit about the theological and historical reference that they use the imperative jihad, also making sure that Dawah is also an important element that they keep in mind?
So basically, what one has to understand about Lashkar-e-Tayyiba, and I think most Indians know this. You still see some people who don't get this amongst the international commentariat. Lashkar-e-Tayyiba has never attacked a single thing in Pakistan, ever. Pakistan likes to take advantage of the inability to distinguish Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, which has, and Lashkar-e-Tayyiba, right? And so you'll see a lot of casual reporters confusing the two. However, what one has to understand is that Lashkar-e-Tayyiba does not attack targets in Pakistan because it is a tool of the state, right? I don't even is Lashkar-e-Tayyiba truly a non-state actor? I tend to view it as a proxy actor on behalf of the state, right? And we can discuss the very economic sense, the very solid economic sense behind using them, right? Because if you look at their capabilities and their educational backgrounds, you get the firepower and competence at least of a JCO, at least, if not a junior officer, right? But I think on average, you're certainly looking at a very senior enlisted or a JCO, and they don't have to pay the retirement benefits. They don't have to pay for the separate schools and the separate hospitals, the whole womb to tomb organization that the Pakistan Army is, and for that matter, the Indian Army, right? I mean, this is sort of, thanks Brits for this womb to tomb concept of service in the military. So it's a very economical way to get the same amount of violence. And of course, they can do this violence under some degree of plausible deniability. And because they're a terrorist organization, Geneva codes, Geneva conventions, wo kya hai? So it's a very cost-effective killing machine. It's also very disciplined. So it has this difference, right? You can kill outside of India, you can kill outside of Pakistan all you want. But inside Pakistan, no matter how objectionable you may find a person or an institution to be, The only tools that you have at your disposal are tabligh and dawah. So if you look at how they deal with Hindus in Sindh, because most of Pakistan's Hindus are in Sindh, a little bit in Balochistan. Christians, in contrast, are predominantly in the Punjab. Sikhs are mostly in the Pashtun areas, actually, for a bunch of historical reasons, because most of the Punjabi Sikhs left. There are a few Punjabi origin Sikhs in Pakistan, but they're the Khalistanis that fled to Pakistan. And in fact, that's kind of what got me into the Khalistan project altogether. Was I spent an afternoon with one of those hijackers that took an Air India plane from Delhi. I was supposed to go to Amritsar to Lahore. He was living in Dara Sahib. He was not in prison. So I spent an afternoon with this guy, and I was like, "Holy cow, this is fascinating." But anyway, how it deals with the Hindus in Sindh is that the government does not provide services to the Hindus in Sindh. So there's a lot of water scarcity. There's a complete paucity of health care. So what the government does do is that kind of what it does in Balochistan for the same reason. It allows Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, JUD, and its various humanitarian social work front organizations to go in and provide those services. And so by leading by example, they convert these Hindus. Now, how much coercion goes on, who knows, right? But when they floated the Muslim Milli League, they had minorities in their party. They had Sikhs and they had Hindus, right? So that's how it works. Now, what I find most fascinating is how it deals with Ahmadis, right? It doesn't advocate killing Ahmadis like the Deobandis and the Islamic State does. It says, it doesn't even oppose them running for office as long as they do so as non-Muslims. So that's really surprising for a group like Lashkar. But it goes to this ethos that they are a tool of the state, and the state does not want sectarian or communal violence. In no way does that advance the agenda of the state. So it bifurcates its activities between what it can do at home, and then all the gloves come off when it's in India.
And Professor, I would like you to expand this a little bit for our audience, because even in India, a lot of people have this confusion of distinguishing an Islamic militant organization like LET from other Salafi-Jihadist groups theologically. Could you expand this a little bit for us?
Yeah, so it's a tough one, right? Because Lashkar-e-Tayyaba is al-Hadith, which means that it does not accept any school of fiqh within, and so that's not per se, that's different from Salafists, right? So this is most of the people who run around people in South Asia, in Pakistan, for example, are Deobandis, right? They are not Salafists. And I'm really exhausted with seeing people confusing Deobandis with Salafists. Jaish-e-Mohammed, it is not Salafist. Hizbul Mujahideen, it is not Salafist. Any offshoot of Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, it's al-Hadith. So this is important because if you look within Pakistan, the mainstream al-Hadith, and that, by the way, the other word that Lashkar-e-Tayyaba uses to describe itself is ghair muqallid, meaning it rejects schools of fiqh. So the mainstream al-Hadith ulama in Pakistan, they oppose jihad by non-state actors. They believe that only an Islamic state can declare jihad, and Pakistan's not an Islamic state. So what this means is that, in fairness, there are not a lot of Pakistanis who follow the al-Hadith creed. So, but they do have madrasas. It means that Lashkar-e-Tayyaba cannot avail of mainstream al-Hadith madrasas. It cannot avail of mainstream al-Hadith opinions or judgments, if you will, set forth by LA Hadith ulama. And that's why it makes it so easy for the Pakistani state to control Lashkar-e-Tayyaba. In contrast, Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban, Lashkar-e-Jang, Sipa-e-Sabe, Pakistan, they're the largest inventory of madrasas and mosques are Deobandi, right? So you have this huge resource of fundraising, and of course, they're not Ger Muqallid, right? They accept the Hanafi school of fiqh, whereas Lashkar-e-Tayyaba does not, right? Most Muslim groups in South Asia are Hanafi. So whereas the groups based in the Arab groups, they actually follow the Hanafi school of fiqh, right? So there's these huge differences. And I don't want to give anyone the impression that I purport to be an expert. But the most important thing is that Lashkar-e-Tayyaba can't draw upon the depth of institutions in Pakistan. It has to have its own. And that's what makes it so much more easy to control relative to the Deobandi groups, where the Pakistanis really struggle to keep those guys on the reservation, right? So what frustrates the Islamic State, which is Salafi, is that Lashkar-e-Tayyaba refuses to do takfir. And there are these, in one of the book part where we translate the problem with takfir, there's this snarky exchange between a Salafist ulama, and he's basically, saying, Lashkar bilkul na mard hain, kyunki wo takfir nahi karta. Laughing. I thought that was the funniest thing ever. It's like, and Lashkar, it's hard to come back from that. I mean, they literally, impugn the virility of the Lashkar-e-Tayyiba's ulama. And then, their response is, we're just more cerebral than you. We just have higher standards of Quranic evidence and who is capable of interpreting that evidence. And you guys are just a bunch of thugs who doesn't care about Quranic standards of evidence. And it just reminded me of, back in high school, I was a total nerd, right? And the muscle people, the people who smoke pot, the cigarettes, the stoners, they would always I'm going to beat you up because you're a nerd. Well, if you could use your words, you wouldn't have to use your fists. It just reminded me of all that high school harassment I used to get. Obviously, you may not share my sense of humor about how funny that exchange was between Lashkar and their Salafi counterpart.
No, I can completely understand. A bunch of people who wants to commit jihad with his masculinity and being called Namard is a bigger joke on them, by the way. But
they don't use the word Namard, but that was the effect of it. The effect was you guys are just a bunch of chutias. You're a bunch of kassis. When I read this, honestly, I couldn't stop laughing. And my husband, he comes into my office and he's like, I am trying to work. Why are you laughing so hard? And I said, oh, Jeff, I wish I could explain it to you. I really wish I could.
But this is actually interesting because I wanted to ask you a couple of questions based on chapters that you've written. And one of them is about Maulana Amir Hamza's Shahrah-e-Bahisht. And you mentioned of how it undermines local mystical tradition and beliefs, which is a big part of Pakistan's tradition. Could you just explain a little bit?
Yeah. Okay, so you will remember that book is harsh, right? They talk about this guy, and he goes and he wants to sit, in the company of this Gadi Nashin, and the Gadi Nashin makes him clean up his shit. I mean, it's like, it is really brutal, right? So Lashkar cannot stand Barelvis. And the reason why they can't stand Barelvis is this notion of Tawheed, or oneness. And in another book that I wrote about years ago, Lashkar writes, Christians take a God and they make a Trinity. God, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. By the way, I was raised a Christian. I never understood what the goddamn Trinity was. So I can imagine Lashkar's confusion. Barelvis take Allah and they make a duality, Allah and the Prophet. So for those proponents of Tawheed, they believe it's pretty clear in the Quran that the Prophet Muhammad was a human being, that he himself did not have mystical powers, right? He was the vessel of the revelations, but he himself was not, he had no supernatural attributes. Well, you know, as I do, because there's a lot of Barelvis and shrine worship in India, Barelvis believe that Muhammad was made of light. He was made of nur, right? And as he was made of nur, he had no shadow. They also object to the rituals, right? So Lashkar believes that graves should be very simple, right? So these, really elaborate graves that you see in the Qabristans, where you've got, tiles, and I mean, they're maqbaras is what they are. So they oppose that. They also oppose rituals like Milad, where they celebrate the Prophet's birthday. Lashkar believes that that is just aping Christianity. And so they are incredibly critical of Barelvis because they violate this notion of Tawheed, and because of these rituals that are completely made up and have no Quranic basis. There's no Quranic basis for Milad in the to celebrate the Prophet's birthday. And you'll notice who's doing it. It's the shrine people that do it. Like, I was just in Bangladesh for a month, and I was in Chittagong, and they were making preparations for Milad. It was just the shrine people. And the people who are opposed to the Barelvis, they also brought out processions to complain about it. Does that answer your question?
It does, actually. It does. In fact, I want to come to a little interesting part, which a lot of our audience might actually connect to. You have referred extensively to Kashmir, Manzil, Nahin, and you've mentioned this narrative surrounding the alleged atrocities committed by the Indian Army in Kashmir. And this volume actually presents an enduring relationship between the local residents and the elite. Could you explain a little bit on that ground of what that literature wants to portray, and Lashkar-e-Tayyaba's major probably mission in India? What does it want to achieve in India?
So one has to be very cautious. You can't read this as history. And I tried really hard to add footnotes when there were grotesque statements of error. I put in footnotes and I said, look, I mean, I couldn't, I didn't get into their errors of interpretation, because the book would have been 2,000 pages. But I did put in footnotes to say, actually, by the way, this isn't true. But the book, you have to remember, is that they're serving multiple purposes. So serving as recruitment, right? Trying to bring people into Kashmir as militants. They're trying to get monetary support for what they do, right? So what they do is, of course, they present India as this monstrous threat to Muslims in India, but also Muslims elsewhere, right? So now Modi, for reasons that should be fairly transparent, that's easy to point to. Look, Modi does this, Modi does that. And the publications talk a lot about what happened in Gujarat, right? So they talk about the alleged rapes of they're not alleged, like Indian organizations have documented the rapes by security forces and other excesses. So they want to make the Indians look as demon-like as possible, right? And they go to great lengths to demonize the Indian security forces, and then also specific Indian leaders. And they also want to play up the alleged victims of these behaviors. And of course, Lashkar-e-Tayyaba specifically, but Pakistan in general, is the champion of those victims and the vanquisher of the perpetrators. But if you sort of look at all of these documents together, what one sees is that Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, they're not really just focused on Kashmir. Their focus is much more comprehensive. They want to take this communal scene that has become ever more pronounced, in part thanks to Pakistan's nonsense, and they want to tear India apart along those themes. And in some sense, they want to effectuate the two-nation theory. And so there are just times when, and this might offend some people, but I challenge them to read Hum Jihad Kyun Kar Rahe Hain alongside Savarkar's treatise on Hindutva. Savarkar says that we lost our Hindustan, and he spells it with an H, not T-A-N, T-H-A-N. He really attributes it to the rise of Buddhism and Ashoka, which made that feminized what was once a virile Hindu man. And he even calls for the demise of these non-virile Hindu men. So that's kind of scary. But he calls for an endless communal conflict to continue to purify India of those religions whose holy lands are elsewhere, right? And he says, as long as when we stop waging this dharam yudh, which is what he calls it, when we stop, we're gonna be reconquered. And he attributes the lack of virility and the cessation of hostilities due to Ashoka and Buddhism to why it was that India was first conquered by the Muslims and then by the Brits. Lashkar-e-Tayyaba and Hum Kyun Jihad Kar Rahe Hain, they make a similar argument. They say the Muslim world everywhere, when we stopped waging jihad, that's when we lost the caliphate, that's when we lost our honor, and that's when we became colonized by the Christians and by the Jews, and also by Hindus, right, in India. And they call for a forever jihad to regain their lost Muslim glory. So I only started doing a deep dive into Savarkar to sort of understand these rhetorical arguments. And at first it kind of surprised me, but then it's actually not surprising, right? Because a lot of what the Lashkar-e-Tayyaba does and what Pakistan does is really rooted in the incredibly flawed notion of the two-nation theory. But Savarkar himself was a proponent of the two-nation theory. So he just lost the battle over India's identity at partition, but he's winning the battle, right? He's kind of winning the war over the long haul. So it shouldn't be too surprising once I sat down and thought through it, because they're both coming from this moment in history about debates about what India should be. And obviously Pakistan propounds the two-nation theory as well as Savarkar. So it shouldn't be a surprise that they both make similarly structural arguments.
And Professor, this is something interesting because a lot of the movement believes on the foot soldiers, and I haven't read the chapter yet on the fighters' biographies. But I would just ask you to paint us a general picture of what this fighters' backgrounds come from, what's the motivation to join, and what's the recruitment process that you saw. Is it the same story in most of these fighters?
No, they're really different. But I'll tell you this. I mean, I did a lot of military recruitment work when I was at the Rand Corporation, and my brothers were Army recruiters. They retired as recruiters, it was a full-time component of the Army Guard, right? So they were full-time recruiters for the Army Guard. And you see really similar motivations. They're different, right? Some people just kind of felt like this banality of life, right? You know, very few of them were from wealthy families, just, you know, middle-class kids. They're not really they're not lacking anything economically. They kind of have what they want. They're just bored. And so, you know, that's the kind of person that joins armies in general, right? I could live here. I could open up a shop. You know, I could set up a cell phone fix-it shop, and I'll probably never leave my village, right? But if I join the army, I'm going to go do all this other stuff. And so you see a lot of that, and there's different variations of it. Some people really claim to be motivated by these atrocities in Kashmir. And I think about the US Army right after 9/11, right? Even though Osama bin Laden had nothing to, even though Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with Osama bin Laden, there was this, we've got to go defend our country, right? We need to go and take care of the problem over there so it doesn't hurt us here. So you see a lot of different motivations. Some people were disgusted by their parents' style, right? They rejected how their parents lived, and they thought they were serving a higher purpose. So the motivations are all different. I think as a sister of soldiers, and my brothers had to serve in the Iraq War, I think what really was hard for me to read, and actually there were just times when I had to put this down, like there were multiple translators that worked on it, and I came and did just spot quality control, and of course I did all of the final editing. It was hard because a lot of the mothers would tell their sons, don't come back a Ghazi, die a Shaheed. And I can think of no 4-star mom here in the United States, you know, gold star mom. We call them gold star moms when they lose their son or their daughters in combat. There is not a single gold star mom who said, come home in a coffin, right? And the reasons that they would offer, I have to say, were so grotesque. They really dysregulated me. And, you know, I have a lot of issues with depression and trauma. And so there were just times when this stuff just re-traumatized me. The mothers would say, die a Shaheed, because then you get to intercede on my behalf so that I can go to heaven, right? There's this idea that a martyr, a Shaheed, can just call to heaven a bunch of people. And sometimes the Shaheed would say that I'm going to be a Shaheed so I can bring you to heaven. Mom, I want you to live like a proper Muslim. I don't want you to embarrass me when you get to heaven. So, you know, and you had sisters saying the same thing. And again, as a sister, I don't know what I would have done if my brothers had come back from Iraq in a coffin. I don't know what I would have done. So it really, to me, highlighted a very different mindset about death and the purpose of death, if you will, the biopolitics of death. Now, we also have to remember that these are also recruitment documents, right? So it's not good to have a bunch of mothers weeping, oh, Lashkar-e-Tayyaba took my son. I have no sons left because they all went and died in Kashmir, right? So that we also have to keep in mind that there's a high degree of bullshit and how these mothers depict their commitment to their son's death, right? So it's very likely that, did they really want their sons to die? I can't imagine that they did. But for organizational and representational purposes, they had to present their subject position to their son's demise in this way. But I will tell you, so, you know, frontal cortex says, oh, this is all garbage. Amygdala says, this is really fucked up.
But is there like any financial incentive to this as well, of joining a cadre?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, they get paid. I mean, they do get paid. They get paid different amounts. And upon their death, they get death benefits. And the death benefits vary. Sometimes it's a lump sum. Sometimes it's like an annual thing, like they get Eid, right? But I forget. It's really hard to know those numbers, but I mean, at one point I heard that the highest payout would be $3,000. Now compare that to the lifetime cost of a Pakistan soldier of comparable competence and firepower. It's a bargain.
And just the cost of a life is just $3,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is really messed up.
And that was the high price. That was the highest I had heard. Now this was, I haven't been back to Pakistan, so I don't know what the current number is. But the last time I inquired about this was around 2004, 2005, and I was in a well-placed position to ask that question. And the highest price was $3,000. So that's $2,004, but it isn't a lot, right? It's not a lot.
Exactly. And especially the cost of a human life, which will never come back.
No. So I write about this in a journal article that I wrote. It's a lot like the drug mafia. So what they do, and I lived in Chicago for a really long time and had some familiarity with it. And then I did a formal literature review to sort of see how it might, to get what the formal studies said of it. And, basically the drug mafia, when a child gets killed, they don't want to turn the mother against the organization, right? So they go to great effort they take care of the funeral costs, right? They try to help the mother out when she needs help, because what they don't want her to do is make it to turn against the organization in such a way that she is vigilant to the point where she doesn't let her other children do work for the drug mafia. And I saw a lot of similarities in the Shaheed reports, which is to say, they would come to the house just like the U.S. military would do if my brother had died. A senior representative, sometimes it was Luckfy himself, would come. Luckfy, really? I mean, these are obviously some of the older biographies. Senior district commanders, they would come to the house and they would knock on the door, and they would notify the family of their son's demise, just as they would here in the United States. Then they would have a big celebration, often like in a soccer field, and there would be senior Lashkar-e-Tayyaba people, sometimes military people would, and of course they would take care of all the funerary costs and stuff. And they would basically extol the bravery. And so they would, and then of course the status of the mother in the locality of being the mother of a Shaheed was just inordinate. So I saw a lot of similarities between this model and how the drug mafias worked in Chicago, which is they're not rolling out the money, but what they're doing instead is they're bestowing upon the family a lot of prestige. Sometimes like they'll build a well, or some other public infrastructure in the name of the Shaheed, right? So the social capital of the families of the Shaheed massively increases. And then there is some financial component, which varies with the particulars of the individual.
So, Professor, my last question to you is, and I wanted to keep this a little broad for you to actually answer this for our audience, because it's important to understand what after or post 9/11 in the geopolitical context of what the impact of Lashkar-e-Tayyiba is and what its activities has been. Especially wanted to understand, in this current situation, we have seen the Resistance Front, like an organization which has ties with Lashkar-e-Tayyiba, has been in much more forefront.
Yeah.
And Jaish-e-Mohammed been in forefront than Lashkar-e-Tayyiba in the last few years as such. How has its activities been in the last few years?
So actually, it's a really good question. So what the Pakistani state does, you'll see sometimes it promotes Lashkar, sometimes it promotes Jaish. Right now, what's important is for Lashkar to really be focusing on domestic issues, right? Because the TTP is back in full swing, And what the way the Pakistani state uses Jaish-e-Mohammed, it's a ghar wapasi program for wayward terrorists. Right. So when it deals with TTP, it's like, hey, we got a couple of options for you here that exclude you just getting a bullet to your head. Right. You can go to Afghanistan and you can help your brothers there. Right. Or you can join Jaish-e-Mohammed and you can go kill Indians. You've got your choice. So Jaish-e-Mohammed is this ghar wapasi program for wayward Pakistani Taliban. And so that's why, for example, in 2009, the ISI spent a lot of effort really working with Masood Azhar and his Jaish folks so that it could be this effective, ghar wapasi. So they go back and forth depending upon the needs of the state. And they're also competitors in a lot of ways, right? So does that answer your question?
But just one last thing that I want to ask
you.
So probably looking at what the context is, if you have to tell this Indian policymakers not to take eyes off the context because these are the same cadres but in a different organization, right? If that's how I can put it.
They're not the same people. They're different cadres. I mean, they have distinct cadres. They're not the same. Right? Yeah. Jaish is going to, what Pakistan really wants to do is take, because the Pakistani Taliban are predominantly Deobandi, right? So they come from Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, Sipah-e-Saba, Jaish, all of those Deobandi groups. And they want to say to the TTP, we're going to kill you. If you want to live, then you have to become a good terrorist, because right now you're a bad terrorist. And a bad terrorist is one that targets the state. A good terrorist is a terrorist that kills on behalf of the state. So we've got two options for you. It's kind of like, when your office is downsizing, we have a couple of packages for you. You can go to Afghanistan, Mr. Deobandi terrorist, and you can work with the Afghan Talibs. They need you there. Or you can go and join Jaish, and we'll send you to India to kill Muslims. But what you can't do is stay here. So that's, and of course, Lashkar, the Pakistani state has two uses for Lashkar. One as a counterweight and a rhetorical counter argument to the Islamic State and to the Deobandis that commit takfir, right? That's one level of importance. And the other is when they need to, they kill very obediently in India. Now, when you see them on the ground operationally, do they help each other out? If some Jaish sees a poor lost Lashkar, yeah, he's going to call the commander. Like apparently they have each other's commanders' phone numbers in their cell phones, right? When they're going into India, the infiltration packet, they use common porters and they use common scouts. So it's the way I see it is like this, like. The United States, we've got two kinds of infantry, basically, right? We've got the Army and we have the Marines. And in the Army, we have the Army Reserve, the Army Guard, and of course, we have full-time Army, big Army. They're all different. Like they compete for resources, they compete for recruitment. But when they're in the battlefield, they work together. Does that make sense? But when my brothers deployed to Iraq, they were always Guard. They were folded into a larger battalion structure, but they were still Guard. They would go home as Guard. So on the battlefield, they work together. But that does not mean that all of their, if you will, their pre-deployment activities is a slur, because it's not. They're at home, they're competitors. On the battlefield, they're collaborators.
Yeah. And in fact, I think that's a really good note to end the conversation, because it makes us aware of the organization and how complex it gets. And especially to understand this, we need a book like what you have written. It's a monstrous book with around
so monstrous.
But I guess if you go through it, end of the day, you will understand Lashkar-e-Tayyaba way better. And I'm sure even Indians do not have the idea of what a lot of it's written.
Probably not. I think a lot of Indian, I think Raw would benefit to see how these clowns talk about what they do, especially the Red Fort attack. But I'll never do this again. I got to be honest with you. I couldn't, I was so tired of this project. I can't even open it. I was just like, done and dusted. I'll never do this again.
But it
At
is
one
an important book for a lot of us, actually. Students who are studying terrorism studies. It's really
Yeah. I mean, I think so that's why I really, so all joking aside, for me, it was, I've been working on it pretty seriously for many, many years, too many years. um, I've my whole dog pack has changed since this book was written, right? But I still remain committed to what our initial motivation is. That if you really want to understand this group, you probably should take advantage of their extensive literature, right? And because unlike a lot of other groups that don't, I remember I was trying to find some similar publications for Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, and they had this book called Shia Kyon Wajib Khadal. Dear Lord have mercy, that thing was sheer nonsense. I mean, fools didn't even have grammatical agreement between subject and the verb. And it made no argument. It was as if someone had just barfed a bunch of stupidity onto a page, you know? So the other thing I hope people appreciate is how sophisticated Lashkar is, right? So I did my own translation of Hum Jihad Kyun Kar Rahe Hain for a journal recently. And I was struck by the breadth of the vocabulary. Like the average Pakistani would have difficulty going through that document because it's drawing from very exclusive Arabic language, from very exclusive Persian grammatical structures and vocabulary, and the extensive knowledge of Quranic history. I mean, and I did all the annotations of this book, so let me tell you, I know how obscure some of those references were.
that might be some work to do the annotations for this book.
Yeah, the annotations. I don't know if you paid attention to the annotations, but I mean, so it's not like, I do other literary translation. As you know, I love translating Punjabi literature. It's not like any other translation, because to be able to translate it, you have to know what the Quranic references, and they'll mention just like so-and-so, and you're like, who the hell is so-and-so? And I got to figure out who so-and-so is. So you can't even translate it until you know what the Quranic, or in some cases, references to a hadith. So yeah, the annotations itself took me 2 years to do. 2 years. 2 years of my life annotating.
I can completely understand the amount of work that has gone through the book, and I think that's why when I read one of the first book in their own words, I remember that was one of the first book I read on a comprehensive, and I posted you for an interview here as well. I remember that was one of the first books I read on Lashkar. I can understand how much of a sophisticated organization this is, and I read the first few chapters, and I could understand the more detail and intricacies that are there in the organization. So I would definitely urge all the people who are listening to this to pick up a copy, read the book, and probably understand the organization in more detail.
And if there's anyone out there that wants to do similar work on Jaish, I'll gladly help you, because I'm not doing it.
But thank you so much, Professor, for taking the time and speaking.
Thank you so much. It's always nice. You have a very soothing